The I as Idea by Jacobo Grinberg, Zilverbaum, 1994. Preliminary Note by Bending Realities. The I as Idea by the enigmatic and brilliant Mexican neuroscientist Jacobo Grinberg invites us into a profound exploration of consciousness, identity, and the very nature of self. At the heart of this work is the question, what is the I? Grinberg, whose work blends neuroscience, psychology, and mystical traditions, sought to decode how our perception of reality is shaped by the brain, and more importantly, how the idea of a personal self is constructed. This book, both philosophical and scientific, delves deep into the mechanisms behind human awareness, challenging us to rethink what it means to be a conscious being. Grinberg's unique approach to the mind-body problem sets this book apart from conventional scientific discourse. Drawing from his extensive research on shamanism and his study of indigenous wisdom, Grinberg presents the idea that consciousness is not merely a product of brain activity, but a fundamental aspect of reality itself. In this framework, the I becomes less of an individual entity and more of a fluid idea, shaped by perception, cognition, and the interconnectedness of all things. For Grinberg, the very existence of the self is a dynamic process, a continuous interaction between mind and the universe. What makes the I as Idea particularly fascinating is its multidisciplinary approach. Grinberg intertwines insights from neuroscience with metaphysical questions that have puzzled philosophers for centuries. He discusses the role of the brain in constructing our version of reality, while simultaneously recognizing the limitations of science in explaining subjective experience. Grinberg proposes that the mind is not confined within the brain, but interacts with a broader field of consciousness, a concept that challenges Western materialist views and draws closer to ancient spiritual traditions. Yet this is not just an abstract or esoteric treatise. Grinberg's work resonates deeply with personal experience, making it accessible to anyone curious about the nature of their own consciousness. He provides thought-provoking insights into how our sense of I arises from moment to moment, shaped by memories, thoughts, and sensations. For those who have ever questioned who they truly are beneath the layers of identity, this audiobook offers an illuminating journey into the depths of self-awareness. Jacobo Grinberg's mysterious disappearance in 1994 only adds to the intrigue surrounding his work. Some speculate that his cutting-edge research into consciousness and reality might have led to his vanishing, leaving behind unanswered questions and a legacy of groundbreaking ideas. The I as Idea stands as a testament to his life's work, a profound and thought-provoking exploration of what it means to exist and to perceive, blending science, mysticism, and personal reflection into a cohesive and transformative narrative. Let's get started. The I as Idea Introduction. This book treats the I as Idea not as an ideation, nor as an absolute entity, but simply as an idea, that is, the first and most obvious of the acts of the understanding that is limited to the simple knowledge of a thing. It is not an ideation in its meaning of genesis and process in the formation of ideas, although it arises from an ideation as its final product. The self, therefore, has as much fixity as rigidity as the idea with which it identifies itself. The self is a relative algorithm of high power, that is, a coherent pattern containing, in concentrated form, a large amount of information. Its relative character is due to the fact that the final algorithm changes according to the modifications of the information that nourishes it. Any object perceived as such possesses, like the self, a character of invariance, and like the self, it appears as fixed and lasting. This means that the I as Idea is not absolute. Its main characteristic is its relativity, and this is demonstrated by the fact that the self can be transformed or even eliminated. The realization that the self is a mania or extravagant imagination, that is, simply an idea, is enough to opt for its transformation. The latter implies the simple act of modifying the identification. In contrast, the elimination of the self requires a more arduous process in which the detached observation of any and all of its transformations is achieved to the degree of being able to attest to the existence of the I as idea that is the product of an ideation. In other words, the observation of the self eliminates it as absolute identity by moving the perception of the self from a position of fusion of the ultimate inner reality with itself to one in which the ultimate inner reality ceases to be ultimate. Since it can be observed, the self is neither experienced as an idea nor experienced as relative. Rather, its experience possesses such a sense of reality that it is revered as absolute. The difficulty in perceiving it simply as an idea arises from the fear that doing so will result in unhappiness. In this book, it is argued that the above idea is false, and that, on the contrary, what ensues from the realization of the identity of the self with an idea is liberation. Chapter 1. The Self as an Algorithm. Ideas are algorithms, and these are nothing more than organized patterns that contain, in a structure, enormous quantities of codified information. The greater or lesser abstraction of an idea depends on the algorithmic power that sustains it, and this depends on the amount of information concentrated and codified in its structure. The algorithm and the idea it provokes in the consciousness of the sentient being represent an informational territory, reduced to a formula that may or may not be linear with the reality it represents. The algorithmic representation is linear when the algorithmic decoding operations are simple and direct. On the other hand, when many reconstruction or decoding operations are required for an algorithm, it is not linear. An example of the latter case is the human body and DNA, which is a high-powered nonlinear algorithm. It is nonlinear and non-isomorphic because the structure of the DNA bears no direct resemblance to that resulting from its decoding, which is the human body. It is high power because it contains, in concentrated form, colossal amounts of information, and because a multitude of decoding operations are required to create the final product inscribed in its algorithmic organization. The greater the power of an algorithm, the lesser its variability or the possibility of modifying its structure. But if it suffers any alteration, it multiplies until it results in a considerable change of its resultant, unless it self-regulates and recovers its original structure. The self is an algorithm of high power and maximum abstraction, with a very powerful self-regulating capacity. Such is its power that trying to change its structure by means of a frontal attack only produces an increase of internal tension, and commonly a somatic alteration that can become irreversible. The only sure way to transcend the structure of the self in a healthy way is to let it be, by accepting it while observing it. Little by little, constant observation produces a change of perspective, from the self to its observation. Another healthy way of modifying the identification with the self is serious and professional psychotherapy, in which the self is known in all its manifestations, and the act of knowing it transcends it. The latter result is equivalent to observation, since knowledge is an inherent attribute of the observer. The observer, however, is not a concrete entity, but a dynamic process. If the observer is confused with the self, it reinforces its existence, and this happens when the observer is given a concrete and unchangeable existence. The self as an algorithm is not the act of observation, but a content of observation. The self, however, is not lived as content, but as a continent when in reality it is both. The continent is transformed into content when it is observed or understood, appearing a new continent that is lived again as the self. In this process, the self expands. The self and the objects of perception, are the result of a cerebral process in which the information that penetrates the nervous system is compared with mnemic patterns stored in the memory. These patterns are, on the one hand, neuroalgorithms contained in polysensory structures, and on the other hand, hypercomplex activation patterns of neuronal populations with a specific global morphology. The incoming information is compared with these fields, and if the afferent and guarded morphologies coincide, the perception of an object or a series of objects is activated. The coincidence is a process of signification or of assigning meaning, and the form of the object appears as a result of this assignment of meaning. Conscious conceptual meaning appears later, but the perceptual object, as a clear percept, is a result of this primary process of assigning meaning. Perceptual objects, therefore, are the product of brain activity, but appear to the percept as external and independent of this processing. The self as object arises from a similar but much more basic and algorithmically powerful processing. The self, also like any perceptual object, is perceived as having independent existence, when in reality it is a product of cognitive activity. The activation of complex algorithmic patterns in the brain possesses, in all cases, a self-conscious character. This is a consequence of the previous considerations. Since both the perceived objects and the self do not possess independent existence, and since both appear associated with algorithmic patterns, these are the ones that must possess consciousness as an attribute of their own. This is not to say that consciousness can be reduced to a pattern, however complex it may be, but rather to suggest that what we call consciousness is the irreducible primary datum. Therefore, a hypercomplex pattern is a modification or modulation of the same consciousness that is at the basis and foundation of any event. Of course, event is also a mental or cerebral construct, and its characteristics depend more on the internal functioning than on any external confirmation. Every certain lapse of time, neural patterns of sufficient complexity are created to appear as objects, and every certain lapse of time, a conglomerate of cerebral operations is perceived as an event. Events do not possess, like the self and objects, an independent and autonomous existence, but are the product of ideation. Chapter 2. The self as a relative attribute of the mental continuum. Each human being possesses a mental continuum that is nothing more than an uninterrupted series of cognitions intertwined in causal relations. This mental continuum is non-transferable and is relatively individual. The sense of being oneself, particular and specific, is associated with the existence of the personal mental continuum and is nourished by its existence. A current thought is the result of a chain of past thoughts, emotions, and sensations. These are determining causes of it and are mutually linked and connected. The interconnected causal chains are a flow determined by personal history. The mental continuum, on the other hand, belongs to a subtle level of reality. The notion of a mental continuum in constant and permanent flux and the identification of the self with it solves the problem of experiential sameness without the attribution of it to a concrete homunculus or to a solid and absolute entity. At the same time, the same conception leaves doubts that are difficult to resolve, such as the idea that even if the mental continuum is not a concrete object or entity, it is experienced as such. In other words, the sensation of the self is felt as possessing a real and unified existence. So, if the mental continuum is responsible for it, how is it activated, and what is the mechanism of attributing its own separate identity to what is a flow and process without real identity? The possible answer to this paradox is that, since the mental continuum is internally coherent, its existence as a whole possesses an algorithmically cohesive identity, and it is this that is experienced as the personal self. From this perspective, The ego identity depends on the contents of the mental continuum, but changes as they change. Thus the self can be said to have a real existence from a relative point of view, but an unreal existence from an absolute perspective. The global internal coherence of the mental continuum could be conceived as an algorithm or global idea, which strengthens the thesis of this book in the sense of affirming that the self is an idea. On the other hand, the experience of the relative self is susceptible of being identified as such. Who or what is it that makes such an identification? The problem of attributing a capacity for identification to a stratum of the self would seem to imply the acceptance that this stratum is the true and absolute self. What is certain is that every human being seems to possess and function from a basic subject that is identified as the self. Also that this self can be witnessed and observed. When the above occurs, one would expect that the act of observation of the basic theme would result in the encounter with the true self, strengthening the latter. What actually happens when the basic theme of the personality is observed is the opposite of ego strengthening. Rather, what occurs is the activation of a level of consciousness in which all structured reference and all notion of identity disappears. There is a real rupture of characterology and a rebirth in a dimension in which everything appears to perception as totally new. The encounter and observation of the basic theme is an extremely difficult event to provoke and requires an introspective power and an honesty that few human beings possess. Therefore, most will never experience what I have termed enlightened ignorance, i.e., the conscious experience of freshness, originality, and total novelty of reality. Those who have experienced enlightened ignorance affirm that in it there are no longer any judgments or conceptualizations attached to an experience, historical and conditioned lack. The state is one of fluidity, tinged with an emotion of ecstasy. Perhaps this is a level independent of the mental continuum. If the above is true, then the mental continuum in its overall coherence is truly responsible for the existence of the relative self, and the position independent of the mental continuum is the state in which the self as idea is identified as such and transcended. Now, in this position remote from and independent of the mental continuum, and therefore transcendent with respect to the self, what exists? In the first place, no one with a personal or individual character attached to a concrete self. Nevertheless, the experience of individuality persists, albeit with a capital abstraction and subtlety. Secondly, an experience of fusion between the observer and the observed. Thirdly, a sense of total freedom. The persistence of an experiential notion of individuality mixed with a sense of unity during the state of enlightened ignorance implies that neither one nor the other possesses absolute existence. This paradox points out that our basic nature beyond the mental continuum cannot be understood from the perspective of a linear logic, and that its existence cannot be reduced to any conceptualization. In conclusion, the experience of the relative self is linked to the existence of a global coherence of the mental continuum that can be algorithmized. This algorithmic global coherence constitutes the basic theme of personality. When this basic theme is identified and observed, a state of consciousness is provoked in which the self and all conceptualization disappear. This state of rebirth into an unstructured reality is called the state of enlightened ignorance. In such a state, the self disappears, and a fusion between the observer and the observed is provoked, but paradoxically individuality is maintained. The mental continuum itself does not possess a self, nor does it experience itself as possessing a self. However, it does possess an internal cohesion and an overall coherence that is interpreted as the self. This interpretation results from a process of algorithmization which succeeds in identifying the global coherence of the mental continuum, through a series of brain operations involving a search for invariance. The brain acts as a computer that analyzes and decodes the contents stored in the mental continuum, manifesting them in very diverse forms, among them the experience of the self. Chapter 3. The events of everyday reality as associated products of the contents of the mental continuum. The global coherence of the mental continuum can be revealed by a topographic recording of the electrophysiological activity of the brain. The latter is a two-dimensional graph of the bioelectrical fields, especially of the cerebral cortex, recorded with the use of a number of electrodes that must exceed 12. A computer interpolates the activity of pairs of electrodes, and the set of interpolations appears as a two-dimensional map of reliefs, shades of gray or colors showing a particular morphology, depending on the subject's mental state. When a set of topograms is averaged over a time dimension of a dozen seconds, the resulting two-dimensional map is invariant, i.e., it resists the passage of time. In other words, an averaged topogram of a subject maintains its morphology on different recording days. This invariance would seem to indicate the existence of a trace of individuality. The evidence for the above is that average topograms differ from subject to subject, and, as I mentioned before, remain similar in successive recordings in the same subject. The above experimental results indicate that there is a minimum premediation time at which the topographic fingerprint of individuality appears. This time is about 10 seconds for normal wakefulness. In fact, both topographic invariance and repetitive topographic patterns are manifestations of the existence of a brain algorithm that could well be the objective and measurable manifestation of the global coherence of the mental continuum. More than 30 years ago, the famous British neurophysiologist Gray Walter mentioned that in the brain there are cycles that can be studied by observing the repetition of patterns of electroencephalographic EEG activity. According to Walter, these cyclical patterns reflect a brain mechanism of self-inquiry or self-sweeping of all the contents that are thus updated. Also, according to this author, the more complex and richer the brain information, the longer the duration of the brain sweep. From another point of view, the topographic invariance and the duration time in which they manifest themselves could reflect the duration of the present of the individuality. In general, the duration of the present for any perceptual function is the processing time necessary and sufficient for the occurrence of a specific qualitative experience. Thus, a visual image requires a minimum processing time, which is the duration of the visual present. The experience of individuality could also possess a specific duration of the present, which would vary depending on the complexity of the personality and the level of consciousness of the recorded subject. Topographic invariance and their temporal relations to states of consciousness would be other records of the duration of the present of individuality or of the overall coherence of a mental continuum. Extrapolating from these considerations, it could be thought that a subject who has transcended his self would no longer show recurrent and invariant cerebral patterns, since the global coherence of his mental continuum would have disappeared, leaving room for a total fluidity without repetitive and rigid structures. One could try to perform a topographic recording on a subject with such characteristics in order to determine empirically whether the loom is correct or false. Moreover, the degree of egoification could be identified by measuring the minimum time necessary until the comparison of an invariant topographic pattern. The greater the utilization of time, the less egoic rigidity there would be. In the same way, and if it were true that the invariant topographic pattern in its minimum time of creation sweeps the brain to the self-perceptive of itself, a longer duration of this path would obviously imply a greater amount of data and processes safeguarded. In other words, an expanded territory of informational possibilities. In this way, a duration of the present of individuality, longer than another, would be equivalent in the above context to an enlarged universe with respect to a shorter duration. The self associated with the different durations would have to be richer, deeper, and wider, the greater the minimum duration necessary to activate the topographic invariant. A corresponding body of events, also belonging to a larger reality, would have to be associated with this expanded self. Perhaps the above explains the daily fact that to an expansive development of reality is associated an external universe, also expanded and corresponding in quality to the quality of the self. Each expanding ego body implies an increasingly extensive set of correlations with processes, events, and objects. In fact, the very level of the self constitutes a body of correlations, so that to each level of individuality corresponds a level of external reality. As the egoic expansion takes place, what used to form the frontier between the internal and the external, between the psychic and the objectual reality, is diluted or dilated and incorporated into a unified matrix, which becomes larger and larger with each passing moment, at the extreme of the absence of the self, when no topographic invariant exists, and the duration of the present of individuality tends to infinity. Everything external would become internal, everything objectual would become soulful, and the dichotomy between observer and observed would cease to exist, as all mystical currents predict in the case of enlightenment and unity consciousness. The sign of the expansion of individuality is the increase of synchronistic events until they become daily and ever-present. The mysterious vision of a magical world in which everything responds and everything possesses meaning is a manifestation of an increased body of correlations now identified with egoic individuality. It remains, as before, an I process and not an I object, although it is still experienced as the latter. The above considerations imply that what we experience as external events are really projections of the mental continuum. Of course, these projections are not simple and less conscious, but only deep psychological developments that allow, to one who possesses sufficient maturity, the capacity to attribute to external events an internal origin. It requires great sincerity and enormous responsibility to accept that the external events that modify and provoke personal changes are really a product of the individual mental continuum intertwined with the mental continuums of other individuals. This enormous power of the conscious mind can be seen in what I have called correlated bodies. A correlated body is a set of mutually dependent events, functioning at a certain specific energy level. An example of a correlated body is the human body, which is constituted by an enormous amount of mutually related and dependent cellular elements, and which functions in its totality as a unit. Another example of a correlated body is a city or a town in which the inhabitants form the correlated elements of a whole. Any modification of a state or level of an individual's consciousness places the individual in unity with a mental correlated body, which, in turn, is associated with a set of elements of the same energetic level. In this sense, another example would be the usual dispersed waking consciousness of a typical individual. In a Western city, its characteristic functioning involves the identification of reality with the contents of his thought. If he wakes up in a bad mood, for example, reality will appear before him as somber and sad, and in the course of the day he will encounter and relate to events and people that are situated at his same level of consciousness. In this situation, he may perceive lousy people, suffer accidents, hear somber news, etc., since his mental level will determine a belonging to a correlated body that includes external events of his own kind, which will reinforce his identification with the contents of his thoughts. On the other hand, if the same individual is in a good mood, his world will reflect a positive state of mind, and the external events will be of the same kind. He will perceive optimistic people, and satisfactory events will happen to him. Therefore, the level of the individual mental continuum will act as a kind of plug that connects with a correlated body of the same level and with external events of similar quality. The synchrony with external events is, on the one hand, perceptual, but also energetic. Before continuing, it is necessary to clarify several concepts that will be discussed frequently in the rest of the book. The first concept is that of the neural field. The synergistic theory postulates that the brain as a whole is capable of modifying the basic structure of the pre-space or spacetime lattice. An explanation of the characteristics of this structure is given in the appendix of this book. Suffice it to say here that what we call empty space really consists of a hypercomplex holographic-like structure in which each of its portions contains concentrated information which converges from the rest. Each modification of the activity of a neuron produces a distortion in this structure, and the set of activations of all the neurons of a living brain activates a field of interactions that manifests itself as a hypercomplex distortion of the lattice. Synergistic theory calls this distortion neuronal field. The neural field coming from a brain has several global characteristics that depend on brain functioning. One of these characteristics is the coherence of the field. The greater the intrahemispheric coherence of a brain, the greater the coherence of its neural field. This same explanation is valid for the frequency of the field, which will depend on the frequency of brain activity, and also for the complexity of brain functioning, which will be reflected in the complexity of the neural field. Since a neural field is part of the pre-space structure, it is postulated that it is able to interact with other neural fields and external events. Thus, the higher the syntagee, or the greater this interconnection. At the extreme of maximum syntagee, what exists is unity. From a psychophysiological point of view, correlated bodies are collective matrices determined by a set of neural fields functioning at a similar synergistic level. Since a neuronal field determines a particular time, a set of these is part of an energetic structure vibrating at a certain frequency, possessing a specific global frequency level, and a particular morphology. That is, it has a certain synergistic value. A set of correlated neuronal fields at the same synergistic level is called, in the synergistic theory, a particular hyperfield. A correlated body gives rise to a hyperfield with a specific syntagee, and it is this hyperfield, the atmosphere, in which the individuals who form it live, and which determines the selections and the external events exemplified above. A proverb says that the quality of matter corresponds to the quality of consciousness, which is entirely in agreement with what has been explained above. The most convenient way to pass from one correlated body to another in a direction of increased syntergia consists in the action of observing a correlated body. It is worth mentioning that observation always provokes a jump in the levels of consciousness. The best example in this sense is the step that occurs when a subject ceases to identify himself with the contents of his thoughts and is able to observe them simply as thoughts and not as ultimate realities. The bad or good moods of the subjects in our examples are nothing more than moods provoked by thoughts. If these could be observed as such, then both mood polarities would cease to be different and become the contents of an observation functioning on a transcendent plane. The change in the level of consciousness produced by such a unification is obvious and is equivalent to living inside a prison and emerging into freedom. Consistent with such liberation, a change of correlated body occurs, and therefore the entry into another hyperfield, another level of external events and encounters with individuals functioning with a similar syntagee. The exact same considerations apply to the self, its living in identity, and its observation. The self is an identity with a certain coherent set of thought contents. Its observation frees the subject, who exercises it from the prison of content, by moving it from the self as identity to the self as the content of a more expanded identity. This shift is a synergistic ascent and implies a broader, freer, and more energetic correlated body. It is still, however, a correlated body that must be known, accepted, and traversed in all its aspects and learning possibilities before it can be observed. It is a rule of life that all its levels must be traversed in their entirety in order to grow. No acrobatic jumps are allowed, since they inevitably lead to falls. Every fall, during an acrobatic jump, occurs because some element of a correlated body is not mastered, and what is not mastered dominates. Chapter 4. The correlated bodies and the self. Each correlated body constitutes a stratum of identity, or, in other words, a self. More strictly speaking, the self that is experienced is the global coherence of the correlated body to which one belongs. That global coherence is the specific subject or character of a coherent set of organized elements of a body. It is experienced as the self because it is always found at the root of all experiences associated with a level of consciousness. Each correlated body possesses a quality of experience, a particular subjective flavor, a specific emotional tone, a typical sense of being, a definite spirit, and an intimacy of its own that is recognized and experienced as the self. There comes a time, however, when the ego sensation associated with a correlated body can be identified and observed, and at that moment transcended. A new sensation of selfhood then appears and is experienced as identity, without knowing that what has happened is that a more expanded correlated body has been penetrated, which also possesses a particular quality, a typical spirit, and a definite flavor. The self of each correlated body belongs to the unity of the correlated body, and therefore remains a mystery that encompasses the elements that belong to it. It is known that an element of a whole receives influences from it, which seem to come from an unattainable and mysterious above. That above which is experienced as self is the unity of the correlated body to which one belongs. In fact, the totality of the universe could be conceived of as the correlated body of greater scope and expansion. Whoever has succeeded in expanding his identity to coincide with that total correlated body will experience as his self the totality, unable to establish boundaries of separation between himself and the rest. This seems to be the characteristic experience of the enlightened mind. Historical figures such as Buddha, Jesus, Ramana Mahers, Hai, and Nisargadatta would seem to have lived part of their lives with that awareness. I say consciousness because, in addition to each correlated body being a particular layer of the self, it is also a particular level of consciousness. Considering that each correlated body of greater expansion includes less inclusive correlated bodies, one can speak of the existence of a hierarchical order in ego identity, as well as a hierarchy of levels of consciousness. The characteristics of a hierarchical level are given by its syntagy, its duration of the present, and the informational dimension of its correlated body. This last characteristic refers to the extension and number of elements that form part of a given body. Thus, identity with the organic body occupies a lower hierarchical level than identification with the totality of the universe. The higher hierarchical level the personal identity possesses, the greater its sense of freedom and the deeper its joy and state of vitality. The passage from a lower correlated body to a higher hierarchical level occurs, as mentioned above, when the common theme or characteristic that identifies a body is identified and observed. But, for this observation to occur, it is required that none of the events associated with the correlated body to which one belongs, nor any of its experiences, dominate the identity. For this to occur, the correlated body to which the self is attributed must be accepted and known in its totality. This guarantees a process of development, which cannot be violated by ethical considerations, but by the very nature of the process itself. In all correlated bodies, the ego identity is an idea and never a concrete reality. It is an idea insofar as meaning, as such, is a reflection of a coherent subject, of a pattern of structured relations, and never a concrete and permanent object. The self changes in accordance with development and with the capacity to ascend various correlated bodies. Now, in the development of consciousness, there are great paradoxes, and one of the most striking ones is related to the dichotomy of the external instinct. From all of the above, one could conclude that the change of ego identity, its expansion, and the qualitative experience that qualifies it depends on and is determined by an external, physical, and circumstantial territory, although the truth is that this expansion really takes place within as a result of an inward exploration. In the intimacy of the mind and psyche, it would seem then a paradox that an inward imbibing is an occupying of external space. What happens is that, in terms of consciousness, the dichotomy between the external and the internal does not exist, and the journey is an exploration of a being that has no geographical location whatsoever. This is the only way to understand the biographical references of individuals who have achieved enlightenment, who, when referring to their state and the path that has led them to it, say, the journey is an exploration of a being that has no geographical location. The way up and the way down are one and the same. Heraclitus, everyone who knows himself knows God. Muhammad, the enlightened one, has always affirmed that the process involves an inner inquiry, a search for one's true identity, and that in the encounter with oneself, a contact with everything is established, inside and outside, internal and external. What lies at the foundation of all these statements is the notion that at the origin of any manifestation, whether external or internal, whether belonging to the world of physical objects or associated with subjective experience, is the very essence itself, and this is consciousness. A limited but very clear way to understand this is to remember that what we perceive of the world is the final result of a process and not a concrete external stimulus. In other words, the landscape before my eyes or the stone in the field are end products of a processing, responses and not stimuli. In fact, it has been shown that one and the same stimulus provokes different neurophysiological brain responses, depending on the interpretation that is activated, so that everything we perceive is an interpretation in which our memories, dispositions, and personal history are mixed. Only those who stop interpreting, and for whom personal history no longer exists, will see the world as it is, but even so, their vision will be that of themselves. Until you change your life and become like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus. In this way, the inner and the outer are the same and only reality, whose substance is consciousness. A correlated body of high synterchia and great expansion is, at the same time, a deep stratum of intimacy, a level of our inner self. Another of the paradoxes in the realm of consciousness is the synonymy between body and process. Nothing could be further from the truth than the consideration that a body exists as a thing, an object. The body that we see as unified and solid is perceived as an object precisely because of its coherence and not because of its apparent solidity. Even a rock is a process of continuous atomic and molecular vibrations, which, because of its enormous coherence, seems to detach itself from its surroundings and to be the very opposite imaginable of the space that surrounds it. However, even here, space and rock form a continuum and possess similar characteristics, the rock being a distortion of pre-space and not its opposite. In the same way, a correlated body is actually a correlated process and its apparent solidity is an interpretation derived from the perception of its overall coherence. In other words, a correlated body as a process is also an idea. Chapter 5. Observation of the Self as a Technique for the Development of Consciousness. Ideas are part of the landscape and of the worlds through which we travel. None of them differ in importance and power from any other element of observation. The error and true sin is the identification with a particular idea, since there the growth is obstructed and blocked. On the other hand, without identification, everything flows and flows into the whole, without any obstacle. The observation of the I as idea frees from the yoke of the self and its rigidity. Whoever observes the self finds himself beyond the self, in a kingdom in which the self is no longer a tyrannical and absolute emperor. Like a revolution in a country whose objective is to dethrone an absolutist and ruthless tyrant, the internal revolution that takes place when one succeeds in observing the self communicates with a flow free of ties and redundancy. There is no longer anything to defend and no one capable of possessing. Suffering disappears, since there is no suffering self. The permanence of the self, on the other hand, forces power, struggle, and violence. In spite of this, the possibility of losing the self inspires fear, and the fact of diminishing contact with it leads to anguish and despair. If the self were the ultimate indestructible and absolute reality, the struggle to maintain it would have meaning, but being what it is, a mutable and temporary idea, changing and capricious, the desire to maintain it, in spite of its oscillations, only leads to identification with them. And in this identity, suffering is the master and lord. Beyond the self, there is what is truly significant, that which is at the root of all changes, without being what nourishes life and sustains consciousness. Religious traditions have called it God. Mystical traditions have called it being. Hinduism has called it Atman, and Judaism has called it the endless. Whichever denomination those who have experienced it have preferred to use, it is what awaits whoever is capable of transcending his or herself. In the previous chapter I mentioned that the quality of matter corresponds to the quality of consciousness. The change of consciousness occurs whenever there is a modification in the cerebral activity and in the degree of identification of a subject with the contents of his thought, including his experience of the self. When a change occurs in the identification with the self and transcends it, the quality of consciousness is modified, and this modification places the subject in close relationship with a more expanded, correlated body, and with all the events, objects, and persons that form such a body. In this way, a person who lives his consciousness with greater quality immediately sees his own state reflected in the environment, as if the external world were really a stratum of his own consciousness, or as if the latter included matter. In reality, the mind-matter dichotomy is only an appearance. The world is part of the consciousness, and those who experience it in this way realize that one of the characteristics of reality is its magical character where events reflect the inner state. The objects of perception are as many ideas, and as such susceptible of being modified according to the identification or not of the subject with them. I said before that even an object as apparently concrete and fixed as a rock is a process and a product of perception in such a way that if the latter modifies itself, so does the former. The extreme of this condition can be observed in the behavior and apparent miracles of the great shamans, who managed to modify the physical characteristics of objects. Such was the case of Pachita, one of the greatest and most powerful Mexican shamans, who was able to alter the physical consistency of material objects. Normally these modifications occur, but in a more subtle order of reality. If the vision of reality is positive, the subject of such perception will find himself surrounded by positive situations. If it is negative, the events will have that character, as if the world and the perception of it were one and the same unit. The sensation of the physical world The I as idea, as an external, independent, autonomous entity, crumbles for the one who becomes aware of this unity, and instead of an inert and cold external reality, the world is glimpsed as what it really is, a set of processes not detached from one's own consciousness. The extreme of such a situation was exemplified by the aforementioned behavior of Pachita. Ultimately, the vision of the world becomes that of a conscious reality, magical and totally integrated to the consciousness. Here it is understood that everything has life, and everything reflects the inner state. The rigid structure of the environment cracks, and the impression is that, through the cracks of that structure, transpires a vibrant and living reality, participant of the consciousness and linked to it. Finally, everything depends on the inner state in which everything is reflected. The conception of the correlated body arises precisely from such a realization. It is known that both brains and objects are mutually intertwined and related. What happens in one place and in one brain affects the rest. This matrix of relationships explains the existence of effects of mutual variation between different instances. There is a hierarchization of correlated bodies, sustained on at least two axes. On the one hand, an expansive axis, and on the other, one of transcendence. The expansive axis refers to the number of events and elements that are part of a correlated body. The greater the number of these, the greater the expansion. This axis is inclusive in the sense that a more expanded correlated body includes correlated bodies of less expansion. The axis of transcendence does not refer to a quantitative dimension like the expansive axis, but to a continuum of abstractions. An example will help to understand what I mean. The events of physical reality, associated with the world of concrete objects, form a correlated body of low abstraction. The events and patterns that precede the physical manifestation, and which in some sense are the cause of it, belong to a correlated body of higher abstraction. In turn, there is a level of reality that lies at the origin of causal patterns, and this level constitutes a correlated body of higher abstraction. Physical science has been interested in correlated bodies of different degrees of abstraction in its quest to find the very origin of physical reality. Thus, this science speaks of a level of reality constituted by macroscopic objects, which, in their relations, conform to the laws of classical mechanics. Thus, physics describes the existence of a molecular level, an atomic level, and a more subatomic level, each of which is more abstract. The degree of abstraction is related to the closeness to unity. The dream of physical science is to find a level of reality so fundamental and unified that it can be conceived as the origin and foundation of all variations. That level of maximum abstraction also constitutes a correlated body. Changes in brain activity capable of modifying the levels of consciousness place the subject in the perception of various correlated bodies. One of the most dramatic events in this sense is the dream state, which a subject enters while falling asleep. There, in dreams, one can perceive what constitute correlated bodies of varying abstraction. It is not unusual to find cases of prophetic dreams, whose predictions are fulfilled with all propriety and detail during wakefulness. Those who have experienced this type of dreams affirm that they had a dreamlike glimpse of the future. In reality, they were situated in a correlated body, antecedent to the concrete manifestation of the physical world of the vigil, and therefore they knew the causal patterns of future developments. Something similar happens to those who, because of their sensitivity, are able to perceive in the vigil a kind of parallel reality, in which events seem to be decided, or in which what happens is an antecedent reflection of what will happen later. The impression of those of us who have such perceptions is that in both worlds the same thing happens, but in a different degree of abstraction. The observation of the self places the observer in a correlated body of greater abstraction than the self identified with any of its contents. In fact, the possibility of noticing the contents of thoughts, without identifying oneself with them, is to access a correlated body of greater hierarchy. In other words, if one succeeds in recognizing the events of the mind as ideas, and not as reality, automatically the subject of experience is placed on a freer, more inclusive and abstract rung of reality, compared to the situation in which he identifies with the contents and confuses them with reality. An illustrative example, in this sense, is the sensation of confusion. If there is identification with the confusion, considering it as reality, one belongs to a correlated body of poor abstraction, compared to the situation in which one can observe the confusion simply as a mental state without identifying with it. In the latter case, by observing one's own confusion, one transcends and places oneself in a place beyond the confusion as an observer or witness of it. Observation belongs to a much freer, expanded and abstract correlated body than identification. In this observational body, there is no confusion or alienation. On the contrary, from there, everything acquires a unified and clear perspective. By being observed, confusion disappears as such to give way to integration and a sensation of greater closeness to what one truly is. That which one truly is situated in a reality devoid of concrete meaning, verbal, non-transferable, and distant from constructs such as space and time. The latter are also ideas, which are the product of brain activity. What we perceive as space is a decoding of the information contained in the most coherent portion of pre-space, which interacts with our retinal receptors. From that portion, the brain creates the images we perceive in which there is transparent space and objects exist. Space is thus an idea and as such can be observed. In doing so, the subject is placed in that which does not require space to exist, that from which space can be witnessed. As human beings, endowed with a brain which possesses the capacity to activate an infinite number of complex patterns of neural activity, we have access to and are part of an indeterminate number of correlated bodies. Those that penetrate our field of awareness are those that, at a given moment, stand out from the background noise of the system. This background noise is an intricate and complex mixture that includes any space-time distortion capable of affecting our neural fields. We already have experimental evidence that indicates that a human brain modifies its electrical activity when other distant brains are stimulated. These modifications are so slight that they generally go unnoticed, i.e., they are not conscious, and rather form part of the background noise of our mind. We also know that every tiny portion of space contains information from all over the universe. The interaction effect between brains is possibly mediated by the mutual interfaces between neural fields. On the other hand, capturing some of the colossal information contained in every point of pre-space makes us a system sensitive to the informational patterns associated with a huge number of correlated bodies. In fact, it can be conjectured that we simultaneously form part of the existing correlated bodies. Therefore, our expansive and transcendent capacity only depends on which correlated bodies we establish an identification with. The passage from one correlated body to another does not imply a creation from nothing, but an access to what already exists. Observation is the mechanism that allows transcendence, since the observer seems to situate himself in a separate reality beyond all correlated bodies. Thus, every act of perception, witnessing, or observation is linked to the mysterious possession of an essence that surpasses all concrete identification. The possibility of observing a correlated body from that mysterious place, which is not included in any correlated body, is, perhaps, our most exalted human quality. It makes us, on the one hand, the possessors of a key that opens all the doors that have access to a state of freedom, and on the other hand, it gives us the opportunity to place ourselves, in any situation, in our true original nature. If we did not have the capacity to observe, we would be fatally determined to remain bound and without the opportunity to free ourselves. Our condition would be inescapable and far from any possibility of emancipation. The capacity to observe, on the other hand, hides it from us, forever and in any situation, to return to our true home, free, fresh and unbound. There is nothing to free oneself from. And from there, even the notion of liberation becomes absurd. Before, when there were identifications with the contents of thoughts, the desire for liberation made sense because there was slavery and oppression. Outside of oppression, the concepts of freedom and slavery become meaningless. One simply is what one is. Thought persists, but it is lived as such without confusing it with reality, and the latter is no longer confused with the objects of perception, but with a state of peace and love towards everything, full and self-sufficient. One desires nothing because one has everything. One possesses everything because one possesses nothing. One is everything because one is nothing. Chapter 6. Syntergia as a parameter of the development of consciousness. Throughout the previous chapters, I have defended the thesis that the observation of the self is, on the one hand, the technique that allows transcendence and expansion, and, on the other hand, the mechanism associated with and responsible for the development of consciousness. Observation, in general, applied to any content of the consciousness, places the one who practices it in a central, unitive position of contact with an essential nature, which is found in everything and forms part of a real self. I have also mentioned that a measure of progress in the development of consciousness is the degree of syntergia in which an individual functions. In this chapter, I will discuss the concept of syntergy as a complement to the observational process. In reality, both, namely an increased syntergia and another that is detached, equanimous observation, form the basis and foundation of the two aspects that define and characterize a full life. Observation avoids rigidity and ensures a path of freedom. Syntergia, in turn, ensures a state of vitality, and observation increases syntergia, so that the latter is necessary to achieve the former. The term syntergia is a neologism that integrates two concepts in a novel word, synthesis and energy. The analysis of the informational organization in space-time is the foundation of the synergistic concept. For this reason, and although I have already described it in other works, I will briefly describe this foundation here. First, the information contained in space-time converges at each of its points. This convergence makes each portion of space and information inclusive, and this inclusion of information is the first and most notable characteristic of all synergistic organization. The greater the amount of information concentrated in a structure, the greater the synergy. Secondly, near massive objects, the informational organization in pre-space undergoes a series of distortions that cause informational coherence to decrease with respect to a distortion-free pre-space zone. The most coherent zones are those with the highest syntergia and are perceived as empty space, while the most distorted and less coherent zones have a decreased syntergia and are perceived as objects. Third, the informational structure of pre-space consists of a matrix in which everything is interconnected. The greater the fluidity in the interconnectivity between the elements that constitute an informational matrix, the more syntergia it possesses. Therefore, the term syntergy is applied to any informational structure that possesses interconnectivity between its parts, coherence, and informational convergence. The latter is associated with the informational density of a process and with its complexity and order. The brain is a magnificent example of a synergistic structure, since its elements are interconnected, include information, and its informational arrangement has varying degrees of coherence. In the brain, a higher intra- and interhemispheric frequency, a high informational inclusion, and a high connectivity characterize a brain state of high neurosynergy, while a decreased inter- and interhemispheric coherence, a lower informational inclusion, and a low connectivity between elements are associated with a brain in a state of low neurosynergy. The higher the neurosyntergia, the greater the power and vitality, the higher the vibrational frequency, order, complexity, and greater the capacity to establish interconnections. The lower the neurosyntergia, the lower the energy and vitality, the lower the vibrational frequency, and the lower the capacity to interconnect. According to the synergistic theory, a living brain continuously interacts with the pre-space structure, distorting it through the creation of neural fields. The latter reflect, in the pre-space structure, the neurosynergic levels of the brain. Since the neural fields, coming from different brains, are able to modify each other, interacting with each other, and with the space-time structure, they develop in this structure a hypercomplex and conjugated. The hyperfield contains the distortions of all the neuronal fields and possesses, like them, a global synergy. Both an individual brain, a neural field, and the hyperfield constitute correlated bodies that can assume different synergetic values. The greater the synergy, the closer to unity, and the greater the development. A subject functioning in a high neurosynergia has a more integrated conscious development than a subject functioning in a lower neurosynergia. According to the same theory, qualitative experience depends on the neurosynergic level of the brain. Since the closest psychophysiological correlate of experience is the interaction of a neural field with the basic structure of pre-space, i.e., the lattice of space-time. Experience, in its various qualities, depends on the congruence between the interaction of a neuronal field of a particular synergistic value with the corresponding synergistic value of the lattice. Only when both values are equivalent is a congruent qualitative experience activated. The greater the synergy of the neuronal field, the greater the vitality of the qualitative experience. The act of observation increases the neurosynergy of the neural field, simply because by observing we increase the coherence, the informational inclusion, and the degree of interconnectivity of the brain structure. Therefore, observation and synergy are mutually correlated, and also because of this, by observing we modify the quality of the experience. Observation unifies the contents of experience that were previously disjointed and dispersed. One of the characteristics of a high synergy in an informational matrix is the existence of high levels of inclusiveness in each of its elements. Since inclusive representation implies the existence of algorithms, the higher the synergy, the greater the algorithmic power. By observing and unifying in an act of observation, we activate algorithmic processes of high power and therefore elevate the synergy. This elevation modifies the level of congruent interaction between the field and the lattice, bringing the experience closer to its unification with the lattice. Since each point of the lattice, in addition to including astronomical amounts of information, contains enormous energies, the increase in synergy nuances the qualitative experience with those energies. Synergistic development implies and is based on an increase in inclusive capacity, and this is achieved through observation. According to the synergistic theory, consciousness and not matter is the foundation of reality. What we call matter is a manifestation of consciousness. Consciousness has many levels of manifestation, the most basic being one in which there is total unity, infinite informational concentration, and maximum interconnectivity. Synergistic development is modeled on such a level of maximum synergy. Observing the development is stimulated as synergia is increased, i.e., informational content, coherence, and interconnectivity are increased. Human experience, in all its qualities, belongs to the same basic consciousness as any qualitative experience in each and every sentient being. A human brain is required to activate human experience because only at the synergistic levels that the human neuronal field can acquire does consciousness acquire sufficient complexity. Therefore, the synergistic theory is inscribed within a monistic idealistic tradition, which only accepts one reality, that of consciousness at all its possible levels. When a human being succeeds in experiencing that unifying consciousness and foundation of all levels, he or she reaches an optimal level of development, what mystical traditions call enlightenment. In that condition, an identity with the pristine or primordial state is established. There is no subject-object separation, and all experience conveys the grace, power, and love of that which is not found at the base of the universe. Thus, one of the most honest and clear enlightened ones of the 20th century, Ramana Maharshi, stated, "The deepest truth is so simple, it is nothing other than remaining in the pristine state." Electrophysiological correlates of the syntax of mental processes. The I as idea. At the base or root of our mental life, there seems to be a continuous and extraordinarily complex flow of changes that fall short of being thoughts, that do not penetrate the field of perceptual awareness as specific events, and that rather constitute a kind of mental background noise. When a topographic record of brain activity is made, it is observed that the topographic variability is immersed, and that the topographic morphology changes from instant to instant. In other words, the activity of the total brain is constantly changing. Possibly these electrophysiologically recorded changes are a correlate of the mental background noise mentioned above. Now, suddenly, several topograms in succession resemble each other, and this resemblance lasts a few thousandths of a second, several tens to be more exact, to later return to the initial variability, and after an interval, to resemble each other again for a while. These coherent patterns are so brief that they do not penetrate the field of perception and are not experienced as ideas or thoughts, but they could very well be the elements that form thoughts. D. Lehman has found topographic similarity patterns lasting about 143 milliseconds. During that time, the topograms resemble each other, and if the subject is questioned, he or she reports having had a thought during that period. In other words, the complex and varied background noise of the system suddenly becomes coherent, and, if it lasts long enough, manages to trigger a conscious thought. Of course, one of the characteristics of a conscious mental process can already be glimpsed here, being the requirement of a minimum duration of a stable or coherent pattern. Therefore, it is possible to think that several of these patterns manage to form some kind of coherent macro pattern, or, in other words, that they follow one another with a certain regularity. This would imply the existence of a regular and predictable pattern of thought. This pattern, with a duration of 1 or several seconds, would be a mental state or a regular mode of thoughts. In turn, different modes could form a chain which would last 10 or more seconds, and this would be perceived by the subject of the experience as associated with a sense of individuality. The results reported in a previous chapter indicate that it takes about 10 seconds to register a topographic pattern that is invariant and highly correlated with an overall pattern that remains stable day after day. The sensation of a self could be related to this pattern, such that the global coherence of a series of thought modes would be found to be interpreted as the self. According to the above, the self is a pattern resulting from a process and never a concrete object. The existence of the self is derived from and results from the syntax of mental processes, and this syntax, in turn, is susceptible to be objectively recorded and analyzed using the technique of topographical analysis of the electrophysiological activity of the brain. For the first time in the history of mankind, we have a tool capable of penetrating mental processes, making their study a viable possibility of scientific study. On the other hand, each instantaneous pattern of the total activity of a living human brain activates the emergence of a specific neuronal field, a set of neural fields, modifying in time, is associated with a thought, and several thoughts, occurring in succession and intertwined with a certain syntax, give rise to the sensation of individuality, which possesses a specific quality. The study of neural fields in their temporal dimension is then an enormously rich avenue for understanding mental life and the qualities of mental life, ranging from what we call background mental noise in the self as idea to the sensation of livingness of the self. The syntax of mental processes associated with the experience of the self is a process. So the thesis of this book conceptualizes the I as idea that is reinforced. The frontal lobe and the self, the human brain, is evolution. The most evolutionary product of millions of years of evolution is the cerebral cortex, which covers the rest of the brain like a thick, wrinkled blanket consisting of several neural layers. There are two main divisions in the cortex. On the one hand, the areas in charge of sensory processing, the primary cortexes, and on the other hand, extensive surfaces in charge of perceptual and cognitive processing, the secondary and association cortexes. Among the latter, the most developed and the newest is the frontal cortex, and especially the prefrontal cortex. Different experiments have shown that the prefrontal cortex is involved in complex processes that have been associated with the planning of activities, with learning involving temporal analysis and delayed discrimination, and possibly with the organization of complex cognitive, verbal, and motor behavior. It could be conjectured that the prefrontal cortex is indispensable in syntactic processes and in the ordering of action strategies involving prediction of future events. Someone has said that this area of the brain is where the future and the past converge. If all of the above is correct, one could postulate a relationship between prefrontal activity and the experience of the self. When an action is performed or a thought is expressed, we observe a series of elements that are organized in a certain complex sequence and order. The antecedents of the action and the thoughts contain neuroalgorithmized, the synthetic programs that will later manifest themselves. These neuroalgorithms are associated with abstract processes and with a quality of experience close to a sense of individuality. The self should be associated with these complex processes. The prefrontal lobe acts as a kind of conductor that organizes and coordinates the rest of the brain system, and therefore its association with the sense of individuality and the self is very likely. This is not to say that the prefrontal lobe is a kind of concrete homunculus, but simply that in this area of the brain the organizing processes of cognitive activity take place. Its activity determines the syntax of mental processes, and as such, its association with the self is close. Human subjects with frontal lobe lesions suffer remarkable changes in their personality and profound alterations in their higher cognitive functions. In addition, they show intense detachment from pain, social order, and events that normally involve ego activity. In Buddhism, it is said that suffering depends on the existence of the self, and that without the self, suffering would no longer have a subject of focus. Transcending the self would be the path of liberation for Buddhism. Of course, this does not mean that frontal injury is a desirable event. It is entirely different to transcend the self than to destroy it physiologically. In the former case, there is development and evolution, while the latter involves deterioration and involution. All that is inferred from lesion studies is that the frontal area is basic to the existence of the experience of the self, and that therefore the self is associated with a process of high abstraction and organization of brain activity. Again, these considerations support the main thesis of this book in the sense of considering the I as idea involving a process and not as a fixed and unchanging concrete thing or object. The self is a process that implies the existence of a powerful global coherence, this being what determines its apparent permanent existence. I said before that from the analysis of the topographical activity of the human brain, several lessons emerge. The main one being the existence of several levels of activity. The first and most fundamental one is of short duration, of great richness and constant change. That is to say, it is the background noise of the system. Superimposed on this are processes of increasingly long-lasting coherences. First, the elements of thoughts that do not exceed tens of milliseconds. Then, the layman microstates involving topographic similarities of about 143 milliseconds and correlating with conscious thoughts. Of longer durations are thought patterns involving more expanded coherence, and finally, invariant patterns of more than 10 seconds associated with individuality. The sense that the self is permanent derives from the existence of coherent patterns that are recurrent and of long temporal duration. The recurrence, predictability, and temporal coherence of these patterns is interpreted as evidence that there is a fixed and permanent self, when, in fact, it is only a process with certain invariant characteristics, but never with a concrete and immovable existence. Chapter 8. The functional organization of the cortex and the self. There is a functional organization of the cortical mantle of the human brain that is a reflection of an anatomical pattern of connections, and that manifests a clear logic. First, the cortex is divided into two large sections, the anterior or frontal portion and the posterior part, which includes the occipital, temporal, and parietal lobes. The border that divides them is the Rolando's fissure. The posterior portion is related to visual, auditory, and somatic sensitivity, and has a hierarchical organization and a polysensory integration system that we will discuss later. The anterior or frontal portion is associated with regulation and with the ordering and programming of action, both motor and cognitive, that is, with the syntax of movements and thoughts, including language. The programming exercised by the frontal lobe is projected towards non-present events, future plans, and prospections. In both portions, there is a functional and anatomical hierarchy. In the frontal portion closest to the Rolando's fissure, the pre-Rolandic area, there is a topographic motor map, known as Penfield's homunculus, where each section of the body is represented. A stimulus in this portion triggers movements in the corresponding areas of the body. Here there is a primary representation of the body musculature. A similar situation occurs for the visual world in the occipital lobe, in which there is a primary zone around the calcarine fissure, where there is a point-to-point topographic representation of the retinal surface. In the temporal lobe, there is also a primary zone of tonal representation, sound, and in the parietal lobe, a somatic representation, the postrollandic zone. Thus, in all cortexes, there is a first hierarchical level, characterized by a specific topographic representation. Adjacent to the primary somatic motor, visual and auditory cortexes are the secondary and tertiary zones. In these areas, the information coming from the primary cortex is analyzed in a system characterized by a more inclusive and abstract handling of information. For example, in the secondary cortexes, information is algorithmized, and in the tertiary cortexes, begin the processes of intermodal or polysensory interaction, where neuroalgorithms are combined, including information coming from different sensory areas. This process continues in the parieto-temporal, occipito-parietal, and temporo-occipital association areas. In turn, in the frontal cortex, the prefrontal portion is equivalent to the tertiary and association area, where action is pre-programmed. There are several cortical integration axes that combine and integrate information. For example, the temporo-occipital axis, whose two poles, the primary visual and auditory cortex, perform functions of topographical representation of visual and auditory information, and whose central portions are responsible for the tasks of association and cross-modal integration. A lesion in any of the extreme poles causes deafness or primary blindness. On the other hand, lesions in the intermediate parts of the axis affect more cognitive functions. The the same happens in the temporoparietal and occipito. Parietal axes for the auditory somatic and viso-somatic functions, respectively. Thus, it would seem that the cortical mantle has a characteristic and repeated organization for all modalities and their integration processes. As a function moves away from the primary poles, both motor and sensory, its characteristics become more abstract and cognitive, and in the intermediate portions of the functional axes occurs the unification of information and polysensory integration. The sensation of the self must necessarily be associated with the functions of high integration and abstraction, and above all, with the portions of the system in charge of the programming and syntax of cognitive processes and action. I had already mentioned the prefrontal cortex as a suitable candidate for this process, along with some empirical evidence supporting this hypothesis. Now it is important to consider that an experience of the self also involves, in a prominent way, the body image. This, however, in order to be associated with the idea of the self, must be algorithmic. In other words, it is not represented in the primary somatic portion, in the post-Rolandic cortex, which contains a sensory map of the body, but in some area in which this primary map is integrated. It is very interesting to recall here that a Buddhist meditation technique, the Burmese vipassana, is used to correct and purify the experience of reality by consciously going through all bodily sensations until they are unified. This unification transforms the experience of the self. On the other hand, the primary motor area, located in the parietal portion, adjacent to the Rolando's fissure, contains a topographical map of the whole body. The motor body image is there, represented point by point, but again the experience of the self, associated with this body image, must be associated with the algorithmization of pre-Rolandic information. The prefrontal portions could be in charge of this integration. Thus, different areas of high integration in the cortex are associated with the experience of the self. Since the latter is a unified idea, it is necessary to raise the question about the mechanism that executes the link between all the various portions of the system. One possibility, already mentioned above, is the prefrontal cortex. Another is the upper portion of the reticular formation, which is interconnected with the cortex and functions as a regulator of cortical tone. A third possibility involves a level of brain activity closer to qualitative experience. In relation to this alternative, I had already mentioned the postulation of the synergistic theory, which states that experience results from the activation of a neural field and its interaction with the basic structure of pre-space. According to this postulation, the unification of the functional zones associated with the different algorithmic representations takes place in the dimension of the neural field. Thus, the experience of the self would be associated with this field, which unifies in the lattice dimension of space the brain activity. Of course, the above hypothesis, to be accepted, requires that it be demonstrated that brain activity is capable of altering the structure of space. In this regard, in my laboratory, we have found positive evidence. This evidence will be the subject of the next chapter. Chapter 9: Interbrain Interactions and the Idea of Self. Before turning to the experimental evidence, I would like to reflect on the relationship between the idea of self and human interactions. To date, it has been shown that the development of the self is related to the quality and characteristics of human interactions. There are those who dare to claim that the above relationship is causal, that is, that the self is a product of social relations, and that without them the self would not exist. Human interactions occur through sensory mechanisms that allow us to see, hear, and touch other people. For the baby, for example, contact with its mother, her smell, the sound of her voice, and her image are essential. A human being in total isolation would develop in a totally atypical way, and with a series of alterations that, if isolation occurs during the first months of life, would become irreversible. Experiments on newborn animals, raised in environments with very poor stimulation, show altered developments in terms of brain maturation. Little dendritic growth and decreased cortical thickness with respect to controls raised in normal or enriched environments. In humans, language learning is important for cognitive development and the experience of the self. In this sense, the temporo-occipital and temporoparietal axes, in their intermediate portions, require linguistic visual and linguistic somatic associations to develop their neuroalgorithmic abilities, these being essential for cognition and the sensation of a self. This sensation seems to require social interaction. It is enough to think that the process that allows a person to feel unique and in possession of a peculiar self requires, for obvious reasons, the contrast that allows for parameters of comparison to agree on the necessity of social interaction to develop a sense of individuality and an experience of self. Where there is a deep doubt and lack of consensus is in the question of whether the processes of interaction can also, in other words, whether in the absence of verbalizations, sensory and tactile contacts, two or more people exchange information and communicate. There is evidence for and against, both in the literature and in everyday experience. For this reason, and because of the postulation of the existence of the neural field and its participation in experience, we have carried out a series of experiments which I describe below, and which, in general, support the existence of direct interactions between human organisms, even when they are separated, and in conditions of sensory and electromagnetic isolation. In the first study, we found that the EEG activity of a psychotherapist and his patients became similar in correspondence with the depth of communication established between them. The greater the empathy, the greater the similarity. In a following series of experiments, we found that the interhemispheric correlation of subjects during empathic communication reached similar values according to the degree of empathy. The same situation was true for the interhemispheric correlation patterns of subjects. They became similar depending on the empathic closeness that the subjects were able to establish. When this communication was very intense, the individual interhemispheric correlation patterns retained their resemblance even when the subjects were separated. In a third experimental series, we found that when two subjects achieved a high degree of empathic interaction and maintained it at a distance, sensing each other's presence when both were inside each other's semi-lensed, electromagnetically isolated chambers, Faraday chamber, if one subject was stimulated, eliciting a cortical response, his or her partner also responded. In other words, stimulation of one brain caused both brains to respond, even if they were separated. The response obtained in the unstimulated subject when his or her partner received a stimulus is called transferred potential. In the same way, if one subject was stimulated and the other was not, in both, a frequency change in the EEG was observed, associated with an alert mechanism. Finally, we have recently obtained evidence indicating that the interhemispheric correlation of a group of subjects oscillates in synchronized cycles even when the subjects are detached from each other. This last result is perhaps the first experimental evidence for the existence of the hyperfield. Not only the brain is interconnected and interacting with other brains, but also the whole organism. In conclusion, there are non-sensory relationships between human brains, possibly mediated by interactions between neural fields. These and other evidences indicate that human communication takes place through sensory and non-sensory pathways, so the development of the self must be influenced and determined by both. In all our experiments to date, direct brain interactions, which are manifested by the similarity of interhemispheric correlation patterns or by the transferred potential, take place without the awareness of the subjects involved. In other words, although the brain of an unstimulated subject responds when his or her partner is stimulated, the former is not aware that he or she has been stimulated. These unconscious interactions are perhaps much more important for the development of the self than those involving awareness, because they are not subject to voluntary filtering. Experimental evidence for the existence of the hyperfield further indicates that an entire community may be influenced by non-conscious patterns that determine common modes of activation. Perhaps part of this explains what has been called collective spirit. In this sense, it is worth reflecting on the extent to which the sense of having a self is really individual. From my particular point of view, in addition to the fact that the self is a process and an idea, its existence and its characteristics reflect collective patterns, partly learned and partly associated with the existence of direct interactions between brains and organisms. The I as Idea, Chapter 10, Quantum Mechanics, the Neural Field and the Self. A profound change in the physical conception of reality occurred when quantum mechanics emerged. According to this theory, there are quantum objects that can only be represented as associated with a certain probability. A quantum object does not exist as a concrete object in a specific position in space, but as a probabilistic system that is not in a precise place. According to quantum mechanics, it is only until the probability cloud associated with a quantum object is observed that the quantum object is defined and comes into existence. In technical terms, the observation collapses the probabilistic wave function and determines a change of probabilities from 0 for an indeterminate position to 1 for a determinate position. In other words, the quantum object that was nowhere exactly and at the same time was everywhere acquires precision and localization when observed. According to Heisenberg, one of the creators of quantum mechanics, there is a level of reality where everything is in potency and where all possibilities of existence exist. This quantum realm in potency, when observed, transfers from its virtual plane one of the infinite possibilities of existence, which is actualized and becomes real. The collapse of the wave function, resulting from an observation, seems to involve a brain-mind system, since the collapse is not performed by a measurement made by an instrument, but requires a living observer. The synergistic theory, on the other hand, postulates that perceptual reality appears when an interaction occurs between a neural field and the pre-space structure. The neuronal field, as we have already seen, is a matrix of interactions resulting from the combined activity of a whole brain. The pre-space structure referred to in the synergistic theory is the realm of Heisenberg's quantum potentia. Thus, the conjunction of synergistic theory with quantum mechanics explains the observation function by considering the neural field as an intermediary between the brain and quantum reality. This interaction, however, fails to explain the quality of experience and consciousness, unless one postulates that the realm of the quantum in potency is pure consciousness and not matter. In other words, the origin of reality is not composed of elementary particles but of consciousness, matter being a product of the collapse of the wave function, and qualitative experience, another product of the same collapse. From this point of view, both objective material reality and subjective qualitative material reality are epiphenomena coming from the realm of the quantum in potency, which as pure consciousness is the foundation of both. The laws of the realm of the quantum in potency can be derived by an analysis of the laws associated with the structure of physical space-time. This derivation is only an inaccurate approximation since physical space is also an epiphenomenon resulting from the interaction of the neural field with the realm of the potential quantum or quantum potentia. In this approximation, it is observed that physical space is a unity and that it maintains interconnections between all its parts, and that each of them contains the informational totality. Similar circumstances could be postulated for quantum potentia, but at a higher order of abstraction. This implies that the realm of quantum potentia is a unity in which everything is interconnected and in which every portion contains the whole. The interconnections in the quantum potentia are non-local, that is, instantaneous. Considering the above, from the synonymy consciousness quantum potentia, it can be affirmed that consciousness, the basis of reality, is one, indivisible, and totally interconnected through non-local relations, and that each of its portions is the total consciousness. The opposite, that the neuronal field acts as a contact of this quantum consciousness. It infects and focuses in the brain-mind system its quality. In other words, each brain, through the neural field, is a collapser of the quantum consciousness, acquiring a particular precision and focus which does not exist prior to observation. From this point of view, any qualitative experience, sound, light, pain, etc., of the brain-mind system participates in the unique and indivisible consciousness, which is at the basis of each and every experience of the brain-mind system. This participation is equivalent to a transfer of the single consciousness into the observer system. The quality of any experience, be it sensory, cognitive, or emotional, could be thought of as handling the basic quality of consciousness of Heisenberg's potential quantum realm. With respect to the experience of the self, something entirely similar happens. The individual self is a collapse of the single consciousness and a focusing of it to a particular brain-mind system, executed through the intermediation of a personal neural field. This last consideration is of utmost importance, and apparently contradicts the thesis of this book, which treats the I as idea, and instead situates the self as a particular focus of a single consciousness, and therefore making it a participant in ultimate reality. In other words, to think of the individual self as a particular focus of a unique and indivisible consciousness is tantamount to saying that the self participates in the only thing that possesses real existence, so that to consider the self simply as an idea contradicts the above. In fact, instead of opposing the thesis of the I as idea, the collapse of the realm of the quantum impotency in the experience of the self supports the thesis of this book in the sense of strengthening the consideration that the experience of a separate and unique self is illusory. The reality is that this experience of the self, as separate, is a mirage, since it is based on the unified. If we were to understand that our self is one aspect of an indivisible consciousness, we would know that any other self is another aspect of the same, and therefore the illusion of separation would disappear. The individual self possesses a relative existence and is the product of a collapse of the one consciousness, which is everywhere and nowhere at once, just like the existence of a quantum object, which appears as a concrete object only when collapsed by an observation. This concrete object possesses a relative and not an absolute existence, since it is a resultant and not an origin. The same can be affirmed of the self. The I as Idea, Chapter 11, from the I as an idea towards unity consciousness. I said in the previous chapter that the laws of the realm of quantum potentia can be inferred from the study of the laws of the structure of physical space. One of these is the interconnectivity between parts, which in physical space is local, but in quantum potentia is non-local. Another of these laws is that of coherence, which in physical space maintains a gradient from the least coherent in the vicinity of a massive object to the maximum coherence in empty space. It can be conjectured that in the realm of the potential quantum, the coherence must possess the highest possible values. It is worth mentioning that the neural field participates in the quantum potentia and the structure of space, and moreover manifests the laws of the two systems in their operation, and is therefore the observational measuring instrument of quantum potentia, i.e., the collapsing medium. According to the experiments that in part have been discussed in this work, there are brain-brain interactions that are not mediated by sensory-type signals, but are realized as a result of the interaction between two or more neural fields. We do not know whether these interactions are of the non-local type, since no one has been able to measure the speed with which two brains interact. Here we know of two possibilities. The first is an interaction at the speed of light, which would imply that the neural fields interact by exchanging some kind of unknown energy, but respecting the maximum speed allowed in the physical universe. Experiments indicate that the interaction can be neither electrical nor electromagnetic, so the alternative would be an energy specific to brain systems. The other possibility is that the interaction is non-local, that is, instantaneous, which would indicate that the neuronal field in interaction with another forms a quantum system, and that they manifest on the plane of physical space, the pre-existing unification associated with the realm of the quantum impotency. This would imply the existence of a pre-spatial organization, as has been argued in this work. The interaction between brains, to be non-local, would occur in pre-space. Only an experiment in which two subjects are placed at a sufficient distance to allow a measurable delay for a signal traveling at the speed of light can indicate which of the above two possibilities is correct. This experiment is a project that could be carried out soon, which would involve recording the potential transferred between two subjects located at the extremes of the planet. Now, the existence of the quantum potentia as pure consciousness, containing all possibilities and constituting in itself a total and indivisible unity, raises the question of whether it is possible that a brain-mind system could abandon itself and assume the unity consciousness proper to the quantum potentia. Since the neural field is the intermediary between the brain-mind system and the realm of quantum potentia, the above possibility could be viable if and only if the neural field could become indistinguishable from quantum potentia. In other words, if the coherence of the neural field increased to the maximum possible and its internal interconnectivity made it a unitive system, the possibility could be realized. In this regard, in my laboratory we have concluded an experiment that supports the above possibility. The experiment consisted of teaching a group of subjects to increase their interhemispheric correlation using a feedback procedure. One of the subjects managed to achieve an interhemispheric correlation of 0.98. That is, he approached the maximum possible value. This subject reported that his experience had shifted from a sense of a separate self and a worldview with the usual dichotomy between objects and subjects, to an experience of unity with absence of self and a lack of separation between objects and subjects. That is, an experience in unity consciousness. By increasing the interhemispheric correlation to the maximum, the coherence of the neural field had to do the same, and therefore its approach with respect to the quantum potentia as well. The subject left behind all concept and experience of the self, and placed itself in a closer relationship with the pure and indivisible consciousness characteristic of the realm of quantum potentia. This experiment points out that the brain system is capable of assuming the characteristics of quantum potentia. Since the chief of these characteristics is the existence of infinite possibilities of manifestation, it might be supposed that one in this condition should increase his fluidity and freedom to extreme degrees, even in defiance of all the conditioning and restrictions that we have come to regard as natural. We recently verified that the EEG activity of the brain of a great Mexican shaman functions at a high level of coherence and frequency. The author had the opportunity to meet another Mexican shaman who manifested practically unlimited possibilities of action and behavior. Pachita, who had possibly achieved an interaction with the realm of the quantum in almost total potency. Pachita was an extreme example of the possibilities of the human that showed me that they are practically infinite. The whole preceding discussion was motivated by the certainty that it is possible to leave behind the I as idea, and that this possibility does not result in unhappiness, chaos, or madness, but on the contrary, it allows access to unrealized possibilities, to a greater degree of fluidity, creativity, and freedom, and to a more satisfactory human condition. In fact, it could be thought that the path of development implies access to an ever-increasing number of possibilities of manifestation and experience, so that attachment and identification with the self constitute a limit and a restriction. At the same time, it is a psychological law that the self cannot be violently rejected or repressed without further consequences. The only healthy way to get rid of the self is to transcend it, and this is not possible if it is not first accepted and even loved. Like any other experience, and perhaps to a more far-reaching degree than others, the experience of the self is a particular focus, a specific collapse of the unique consciousness that lies at the foundation of the real. To reject it with violence implies placing oneself against the very origin of reality, which, besides being absurd, is dangerous. The I as idea epilogue. The foundation of reality is consciousness, and this in itself is self-referential, unitive, and non-local. The separated self is an epiphenomenon, an idea, although it arises from the single consciousness. The I as idea implies a separation and a division in which a being that is originally not divided confuses a particular focus of consciousness with a disintegration. This confusion is secondary, cognitive, and ideational. The correct understanding of the experience of the self is that the self is a specific channel of the stream of consciousness, and therefore its existence does not imply a real separation. The incorrect understanding is to consider the experience of the self as evidence of a real division in which each self is fundamentally separated from others and from everything to form a separate, concrete, objective island. The one consciousness is manifest in every single quality of experience, from the most elemental sensation to the experience of self. The same consciousness is in the sound we hear, in the light we see, and even in the pain we suffer. The brain is a measuring instrument that functions by algorithmic gradients on several axes: visual, auditory, somatosensory, and action. In each axis there is a process of information representation that goes from a concrete, topographic, and relational pole, point to point, in the primary cortexes, to an abstract cognitive and algorithmic unification pole in the secondary, tertiary, and association cortexes. The unification of the perceptual experience and the sensation of the self implies the creation of a neural field, a matrix of interactions between all the neural elements, which unifies the brain activity in the pre-space structure. In this way, phenomenologically unified images emerge, although their cerebral representation is dispersed. In the same way, the unified experience of a self appears, which, at the cerebral level, implies the simultaneous but distant activation of all the poles of abstraction in the representational axes referred to above. The pre-space structure is a model of Heisenberg's quantum potentia, quantum level of all possibilities. The neural field interacting with that level gives rise to the quality of experience, or rather manifests consciousness, unique in the different qualities of experience. In other words, the neural field is the cerebral mechanism capable of collapsing one among the variety of possibilities located in the field of unitive consciousness, in the realm of the quantum in potency. In a more informational than qualitative sense, the self can be analyzed as associated with the global coherence of a mental continuum. Constantly, there is an uninterrupted flow of thoughts, ideas, sensations, and emotions. One can conjecture the existence of a syntax in this ideational stream and of an internal coherence which functions as an invariant that can be algorithmized. The self, which is also a relative invariant, could be precisely the algorithm of coherence, or, if you will, the model, attractor of the mental continuum. Thus, the I as idea is a dynamic process, although it is experienced as a concrete object. The concretization of the self produces rigidity and depends on the degree of identification of the subject of experience with its contents. This identification is inversely related to the sensation of freedom and fluidity that any human being has the right to experience. In the same way, the more rigid the idea of self is, the more suffering it provokes, since its loss or threat activates an experience of death. In other words, the more rigid the idea of the self, the more the possibility of losing it is experienced as a painful threat of death. The I as idea is a restricted and therefore relative identity, but it is experienced as absolute and total. Any doubt that calls into question its absolute character is experienced as a heartbreaking, annihilating possibility. Therefore, the greater the rigidity of the self, the more psychic energy the self as idea will be used to maintain it, and the greater the wear and tear and devitalization of doing so. On the other hand, without the self, access is open to unified consciousness and all the possibilities contained in quantum potentia, greater freedom, fluidity, and creativity. The syntergia of the neuronal field is the measure of its approach to or departure from the pure realm of consciousness. The greater the syntergia, the greater the closeness to the light of consciousness. At the highest syntergia, the quality of qualities, pure consciousness is experienced, and with it all the meaning, power, and joy of the foundation of the real become accessible. Beyond the self as idea lies reality. Access to it is the meaning of human existence. Without self, there is no suffering or attachment, for there is no one who suffers. Moreover, without self, the experience of time disappears to give place to an experience in a timeless present where each event is tinged with a pure existence without judgments or comparisons, without any concern about the past or the future. Tibetan Buddhism calls Rigpa the realm of the quantum impotency, the unique self-referential consciousness. The same tradition affirms that everything we experience and perceive comes from Rigpa and disappears into it. Tibetan Dzogchen is the meditational tool that allows access to Rigpa and consists of maintaining in each experience the awareness of its origin in Rigpa. In Dzogchen, the meditator places himself beyond his self and perceives each sensation, thought, or emotion as enlightened and coming from Rigpa until everything becomes a single consciousness. In this way, it is not only possible to understand the experience of the self as a relative focus or manifestation of the one consciousness, but to live the latter directly. As promised in the introduction to this work, I have analyzed the I as idea and shown that what happens when this idea is transcended is access to freedom. The consideration of the existence of the single consciousness as the basis of reality implies that everything, including matter, has its origin in consciousness. This is an idealistic monism in which the synergistic theory is inscribed. The manner in which this single consciousness manifests itself in apparent diversity implies a collapse of the wave function from the realm of the quantum impotency. The mechanism that achieves this collapse is the brain through the activation of the neural field. Depending on the syntagee of the neural field, a congruent interaction with one of the layers of the quantum potentia is achieved, and the result of this operation is what is experienced. The quality of the experience arises from this interaction between the neural field and Rigpa, together with all the details and characteristics that make each percept a specific manifestation. The quality of the self and its characteristics have the same foundation. The difference between any specific percept and the experience of the self is only one of degree. The self implies greater coherence and invariance than a specific perceptual experience. Both, however, reflect the existence of a basic level of reality. The I as idea implies an identification with some layer and content of experience other than the basic level of reality. The idea of the self as a body and intellect, a mind, or with the possessions of these, is an idea that does not possess the attributes of Rigpa, the realm of the quantum impotency, i.e., in them there is no unity or transcendence, no total self-reference. All of them, however, exceed to the condition of being able to be observed. Since only pure consciousness cannot be observed, it can be concluded that the act of observation must be situated in a stratum of transcendence, close to Rigpa and beyond all content of experience. Thus, the observation of an identification or an idea of the self serves to transcend it and has been used as a developmental technique. In other books, see Self-Elusive Meditation and Meditation, I have gone deeper into the use of observation, so I refer the interested reader to them. Suffice it to say here that any content of experience can be observed, and this observation produces a liberating effect with respect to the identifications of the self. Human life is replete with ideas of self, concrete identifications, which at every stratum of development beckon us and deceive us with an illusory aura of permanent satisfaction. Sooner or later, however, they manifest themselves for what they really are, temporary illusions whose pleasure was spurious, and whose identification with the self led to a state of confusion and dissatisfaction. But at the same time, life is full of opportunities for advancement and development that must be seized in order to free oneself from attachments and concrete identities. It is up to each one to assume an idea of the restricted self, or to opt for freedom from the self, knowing that beyond the self lies the reality of pure consciousness, the realm of all possibilities. But observation or Dzogchen meditation are not the only tools we have in our true development. Even the deepening of any idea of the self must be able to lead us to pure consciousness, since it is the origin of all experience, including the self. That is why one of India's greatest mystics, Ramana Maharshi, proposed deep inquiry into the self as a technique for transcending it. It is not a matter of denying diversity and all its richness, but rather of remembering its origin and avoiding the blockage and rigidity implied by a concrete identification. Knowing that an experience of the self is a relative idea, a process, and not the last redoubt of reality, and remembering that beyond the self is not emptiness, but fullness and freedom, have been the motives behind the writing of this work. This freedom and fullness seem to imply a quantum leap, both physical and interpretive. We generally assume that reality functions in a continuous way, and that a resultant of any process involves a series of linked steps. The sun, for example, does not suddenly disappear over the horizon during a sunset, but rather gradually sets. The digestive process lasts several hours and involves a graded, step-by-step chaining of linked conditions. Examples such as the above abound in the macroscopic natural order, but are absent at the quantum level. Here the electron changes its orbital, suddenly, and without intermediate steps, or two correlated photons are modified simultaneously independently of the distance that separates them, and without signals being transmitted from one to the other. The quantum level of reality seems to us totally paradoxical and contradictory with respect to the perception of a continuous and graded world, but this impression disappears when the self does the same. The perception of a continuum depends on the existence of the self. Without this existence, reality acquires a quantum character in which it is perceived without time and space, and where all objects arise simultaneously and causally, without intermediate steps. In fact, this quantum character lies at the basis of the very mechanism of the creation of experience, that is, in the manifestation of some possibility located in the quantum potentia, by means of the collapse exerted by a neural field. When the self ceases to be the rector of perception, reality is experienced as it is, quantum and sudden. This natural vision breaks the prison of continuity and assumes a miraculous character. In the interaction between the neuronal field and the quantum potentia, without the intermediation of the idea of the self, an unknown freedom and fullness are manifested in comparison with the perception of reality. When there is an identification with some idea of the self, in both cases there is a collapse of possibilities of the quantum potentia by the neural field, but without self. The perceptual manifestations resulting from the collapse are free from interpretations, while with self the interpretations restrict and limit. This difference is essential since the limitations exerted by the idea of self are real. That is, they impede and block manifestations by acting as a filter that only lets through what is found, in accordance with the interpretation, and closes the way to possibilities that do not conform to it. The sifting of possibilities occurs automatically and unconsciously, since it depends on the syntagee of neuronal time. The greater the latter, the greater the amplitude of the possibilities of manifestation up to the limit where the neuronal field, in its maximum syntagee, becomes indistinguishable from the structure of pre-space, and there the quantum potentia can manifest itself without restrictions. On the other hand, in a poor syntagee, the functioning is limited and the possibilities of creation are less. All this implies that reality is being created at every instant by the interaction between the neural field and the pre-space light structure, the quantum potentia, which is in accordance with the Jewish conception of constant creation ex nihilo. Since the quantum potentia, before being manifested by a collapse, is invisible, this creation from nothingness makes sense and corresponds with the Buddhist conception of form as coming from emptiness. There are several examples of the freedom and fullness that can be experienced when identification with an idea of the self disappears, which support the consideration of the quantum character of perceptual reality and conscious activity in general. The first example is associated with extraocular vision, which I have discussed in other works. See the angelmatic light and the creation of experience. So here I will only mention that it is the perceptual ability that allows a child to see without using the retina. First of all, extraocular vision can only be taught at ages at which a consolidation of an idea of self has not yet occurred. When the ability does appear, its behavior is of a discrete or quantum type. That is, there is an abrupt transition from its absence to its presence. Presumably this implies that the neuronal field suddenly manages to collapse possibilities of quantum potentia linked to visual reality, and these are manifested in perception. VIII requires special training to acquire the extraocular ability, training aimed at increasing neurosynergism. An illustrative case of the quantum character of extraocular vision was that of a blind child, trained by the author, who managed to acquire this perceptual ability, but with oscillating manifestations in which he abruptly managed to perceive objects and then suddenly stopped perceiving them. A second example already mentioned in this book is the transferred potential, which is a manifestation of the correlation existing between two distant brains when one of them is stimulated. This potential seems to have a quantum and statistical character, in the sense that sometimes it is present, and sometimes it is absent. Possibly this implies that only when both subjects manage to collapse their existing correlation union in the quantum plane, this union is manifested at the cerebral level. For me, the most impressive example of the quantum functioning of the consciousness has been, without a doubt, that of a Mexican shaman I mentioned before, called Pachita. Pachita not only achieved a perceptual collapse from quantum potentia, but a concomitant physical alteration. The latter occurred without apparent intermediate steps, i.e., it conformed to a quantum behavior. I remember an occasion when, astonished, I witnessed an operation performed by Pachita, which involved the complete transplantation of a lung to a patient suffering from lung cancer. The grafted lung was placed in the thoracic cavity after removing the diseased lung, and without an appreciable interval, it began to function normally, as if all its tissues and processes had interconnected with the recipient organism without intermediate steps. The comment offered by this shaman as an explanation for this and other of her abilities was that her intention was enough for it to be realized. That is to say, the manifestation happened when her possibility collapsed. Pachita did not possess an idea of the self, even remotely similar to that which is commonly held. Her sense of self was linked to a transcendent plane, the quantum potentia, in which she acted as an intermediary. Her neural field must have functioned at a high neurosynergic level to flow with the freedom and power as it did. The pre-space structure is a physical model of what on another level Heisenberg called quantum potentia, as I described it earlier. The same pre-space structure has been called the lattice of space-time, referring to the fundamental or basic matrix of physical reality. Beyond that foundation, quantum potentia has been referred to in various ways. I have already mentioned that Tibetan Buddhism knows it as Rigpa. In Jewish mysticism, it is called the Or Ein Sof, which literally translates as endless light. Mystics of all times have referred to the existence of a sublime experience that would seem to involve a direct contact or experience of Rigpa, quantum potentia, or Ein Sof, which is generically referred to as the state of enlightenment. Pachita would seem to be a feminine example of the human possibilities when such contact is realized. This book would be incomplete without an analysis of the experience of enlightenment, since it is a direct result of the feat of transcending the self. Therefore, the second part of this work is devoted to describing the experience of enlightenment in what I have called the taste of enlightenment. The end. If you liked this audiobook, share it with the people you appreciate the most. Thank you for following the channel Bending Realities. A big hug, and may the infinite wisdom of the Creator guide you always.